Welcome back to 26 North Halsted. Today talking with civil rights attorney Brendan Shiller, all about your legal rights, people's legal rights and comparisons to our system here in Chicago, the United States, to other systems in the European Union. Before the break, you were kind of explaining that in Britain, they have a team of people that aren't necessarily lawyers, but are there to provide a certain level of legal counsel to people as they arrive at the station.
So the way the whole system actually works in Britain is it's mostly public funded. There's a system that's ran by the local bars for the most part, where the police, the custody sergeant, and this is all written into law. This has been written into law since the mid-'80s. There's somebody that's called a custody sergeant who works independently, theoretically, from the police. The first person to talk to an arrestee, they have a 6-page litany of rights they're supposed to tell the arrestee. And then if the arrestee wants an attorney, custody sergeant then has the civilian in charge of the duty day attorneys call an attorney and then put that attorney on the phone with the arrestee right then and there, and then that attorney has 45 minutes to get to the police station. The attorneys are essentially, there's either attorneys or these trained advocates who work for the attorneys, and they're all listed on a duty day. They're kind of randomly rotated and by the program that's supervised by the bar. What's happened is it became a very profitable engine for certain attorneys that had some ingenuity. What they did was they hired a bunch of these advocates so that they could be in the rotation, the non-attorney advocates, and then they end up with most of these people's clients for their overall law firm. So there became a very big economic incentive for people to send people to the police, for attorneys, solicitors send these advocates to the police station at a very reduced rate. They're getting paid essentially 60 euros for a police station visit, which is probably 1/10 of what people would charge here, about 500. You know, people would usually charge $500. But it's because they're bringing in so many clients as a result of it, and they're paying non-attorneys to do it. It actually works out well. Even though the government pays the initial fee, it ends up in a reduced rate for the government because more private attorneys pick up these cases.
What an interesting system. Now, how would something like that work, or what would that look like if it were happening here?
So, like I said, I was really riding the coattails of First Defense. First Defense is a nonprofit local group that tries to provide volunteer attorneys at the police station. Again, the thinking being that if you're at the police station, you can prevent false confessions. You can save money in the long term. In fact, there was a recent study just put out by the MacArthur Foundation that said just that. If there was universal representation at the police station, it would actually save the county money. So the most simplest way,
you have to explain to me how is that money saved?
Sure. If there's universal representation at the police station, there will be fewer false confessions, because there still are to this day. There will be fewer people wrongfully incarcerated in Cook County Jail. There will be fewer people wrongfully incarcerated in IDOC, the Illinois Department of Corrections. And in the long term, it saves a lot of money. And this was a MacArthur Foundation study that said that. There's a variety of ways it could be done locally. The most straightforward way was essentially to say the public defender, the Cook County public defender, needs to have representation at every police station now. And that's something that a handful of counties and municipalities have done in the country. It's not something that's required to do under our current jurisprudence in analyzing the right to an attorney, but it's something that can be done and save a lot of money. But there's a variety of other ways it could be done.
How do you work around, I would assume law enforcement would feel that you're interfering with an ongoing investigation at this point, and to have this non-attorney individual here at this point in the process is disruptive to the investigative process.
There would be a huge backlash and a huge reaction. But the real point is, and what we witnessed in London, and we've seen here in other aspects, is legislation can change culture. And in London, in talking to the police officers, there was a different cultural perspective than there is here. Law enforcement came to the perspective that, you know what, we don't really care about statements or confessions so much anymore. If they want to talk to us, great, and we'll take it. And then we know that after they've talked to the lawyer, they're talking to us, that it's probably a real legitimate confession. But what this has forced us to do, what this forced them to do, they tell us, is really use good investigative techniques to actually ferret out what really happened.
That seems almost contradictory to the reliance on confidential informants and things like that in an investigation, because it would seem like that would be even less important as well as a person as a false confession.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Well, I mean, in terms of police investigations and building cases against people, they bring in these confidential informants. Their word is would seem to be null and void in an environment where people think that even just a person's false confession is no longer necessary.
Yeah, you know, that's a great point, and I didn't have that conversation because if you're not bringing people in and kind of intimidating them, you're also less likely to get information about other crimes.
Think,
right. So that's a good point. That conversation wasn't had. One conversation was had. There was an exception in both England and in France where we were, in multiple places in France. There was an exception to this general rule, which is if there's any pending danger. So if there's a bomb or if there's a kidnapped child that's somewhere, any kind of situation like that, then there isn't a requirement of an attorney. There's also a huge distinction in terms of the law and the culture there that has to do with whether people talk. Here, the culture is 99.9% of the time when an attorney shows up to a police station, the advice is don't talk. Both in Britain and in France, for two completely different reasons, that was the advice only 50% of the time, literally 50% of the time. It was actually studied in both countries. Actually, 50% of the time in Britain and 20% of the time in France. In Britain, it was the advice only 50% of the time because the law is a little different. You have a right to remain silent, but certain inferences can be drawn against you if you do remain silent. That's not the law in this country.
Okay.
So for that reason, oftentimes, people actually would talk. But again, they would talk after they discussed all their options with their attorney, after they felt confident, after they didn't feel so isolated and intimidated by the police, and when they were more likely to be honest. And then in France, it's a bizarre culture. It was described as essentially people feel obligated to talk in France.
Interesting.
And remember, this is only 3 years old in France. This has been going on for 30 years in Britain. France is one of the recent countries that had to institute this because of the European Union's constitutional ruling, court ruling 2010. They didn't institute it till mid-2011, so it's less than 3 years old. But the statistics show in France that only 20% of the time do people actually not talk. And 80% of the time, even when represented by an attorney, they still talk to the police in France. So,
and could that have something to do with, generally looking at the levels of punishment for certain crimes? The consequences are less with some of the crimes that we're talking about, petty crime and misdemeanor.
In a way, yes and no. In some things, sentencing is actually much greater and much stringent. But there's a variety of things where there's basically at the police station pre-trial diversions and results. Most often, there's more particularly in Britain, there's a lot of crimes where they just work it out and they pay a fine. And so there's.
So it really is a cultural difference in terms of law enforcement there. I tell you what, let's take another short break. When we come back, we'll have more with Brendan Shiller. Stay tuned.